The following is a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Welcome to Masonic Central, the podcast for Freemasons by Freemasons. Now, here are your hosts, Greg Stewart and Dean Kennedy.
I know this week we've got a pretty special guest on that with the new book that I've had a chance to read that I really like. Dean, you've had a chance to read this book, and I read earlier today that you were powering through it, and I've spent the better part of the last couple of weeks having a chance to go through it. The new book, Building Hiram, Uncommon Catechism for Uncommon Masonic Education, Volume 1 by John Nagy. Welcome to the show, John.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I really appreciate you coming on. This we talked earlier in the week, and I mentioned it then, but I think it's important to tell everybody that I had a chance to read this book, and I really love it.
I'm glad to hear that. In fact, every time I reread it, I get more insight into what it is that I've written.
It's unassuming. It doesn't really jump out and just say, hey, this is all that's in here. Really, you have to mine it out, but it's not too far that you have to dig down on it. So to get through it much?
I sure did. I think I only missed one section in the middle, to be quite honest, and I'm going to go back and read that, actually, after the show is done. So,
reading around the edges. I'm curious, John, why do we need a little book like this, Building Hiram?
I don't know if we need it. I know that I definitely needed it. I think I started somewhere around 2001, 2002 as a Mason entered. And over the years, I've been asking a tremendous amount of questions about how things interconnect. And I finally had to resort to my own research, make my own connections. And this book basically was my effort to make sense out of what was right before me. And I know I needed it. I wasn't getting the answers I wanted. So I embarked on putting something down on paper to help me make better connections. And as I did, I found that there's a lot more here than meets the eye.
No, I just found that you asked me if I was reading around the edges, but I just picked it up anywhere, and I just started reading the book. I tried my best to start at the beginning of each section, but I just found it interesting just starting just anywhere. It was one of them books I could pick up and go from any page and just learn something by reading it, and I really thought it was interesting. I mean, this is the first book I've read in months, Greg. I just learned how to read this book, actually.
Well, you know,
joking.
So what Dean is saying, though, is that I mean, really, it is a pocket-sized book that's meant to be carried, and that someone could pick up something just by flipping through it and landing on a page. Would you say that that's true, John?
Absolutely. I can pick this book up at any section and reread it myself, and I wrote it, and the connections just jump out. In fact, it was only after I wrote the book that I went back and I reread The Staircase Unwound, and the insight in that whole section that I walked away with is how paramount those last 7 steps are. That we hear about them, we talk about them a little bit. In fact, there's a lot of speculation about what they actually mean for us as Masons. And what I came away with is that the actual raising of a Mason occurs as a consequence of traversing those last 7 steps. That was found for me. I walked away saying, wow, the raising of the Mason that is done in Lodge is actually an acknowledgement of what the man has done himself. That's a lot to say.
And Greg, if you have your book open, it's page 56 that he's talking about, actually.
I'll open to it right now. What did you think, Dean? I mean, did you have a chance to get to that section?
Here's my take on the whole book, actually, and to summarize it, we're gonna spend a lot more talk. I think what it does is it takes the ritual, kind of breaks it apart, and then takes it back from another angle, and really helps people analyze it in a way so they see it from a different angle. And what I really liked about it too was that John took the time. If there was something missing in one, like he refers to English ritual, and then and says in this ritual you might have this, and in this ritual you might have that. And I really thought that was useful to say, look, this might not be happening in your ritual, but it's happening over in this other ritual. And I found that valuable. I'm going to go through my own ritual and see where that fell in all these notes that he was making. And it was quite interesting because there are some differences, and he goes into some of those differences.
Yeah, pointing out things that perhaps someone may not necessarily understand coming at it. That it may not be something that they're familiar with, especially if they're a new Mason or even an older Mason that just has never taken the time to realize these things and discover them for themselves. It's funny that what you mentioned on 56 is actually a theme that I found throughout, which goes back to the idea, John, that in these different summaries, there are little stories that almost have a feel as if they happened in your own backyard. The one in particular that I was referring to, the real quick allegory of the tree that falls and the reasons for its falling. I hope you remember that one offhand. Does that one come to mind?
The oak tree, Greg.
Yeah, the oak tree out in the backyard. That oak tree was planted on an embankment, and one of the hurricanes that came through, it was ripped up. And tried to prop it back, and what I found is that basically the foundation, while I had tried to prop the tree back, the foundation had been ripped up, and the roots had rotted over a 6 to 9 month period. And I was looking out my back picture window at the wildlife sanctuary that my picture window overlooks, and in the middle of the day, this thing just fell over in plain view. I mean, there was not even a wind coming by, it just fell over. And when I went over, I inspected it and recognized that the very foundation it was built upon was no longer there. And that was just kind of looking at the integrity of the tree, recognizing that no matter how good the above ground looks, if the foundation is not having any integrity, nothing's going to hold up. That particular story has a lot of ramifications to what it is I understand going on in the EA preparation for the fellowcraft. There is so much that can be gleaned by an EA coming through, looking at their own foundation. What is their morality? What is their ethics? What is their civility? And if they get a very firm grasp of what they truly value, of course, with the guidance of ritual, their foundation of what it is that they will build into the future will be unshakable.
Great. Pulling my thoughts together, the aspect of this fallen tree and the fact that it was built on a rocky foundation or perhaps on an unprepared foundation, but it speaks to the preceding aspects of the catechism that the candidate had just gone through. So this being a sort of a summary of the thought to it, the aspect of what can happen, I guess. That brings up one question, though, and that is, and everyone's always sensitive. I mean, on our website this week or last week, we put up a video from Martin Falk, and we had a little bit of commentary about, maybe he was letting out too much. But you take your book and you introduce a very different format in which, well, you tell how you word it, but you really do keep the whole secrecy component, I feel, while still discussing everything. I'll kind of let you take it away. Well,
I did not use any of the current day ritual. What I did was I went back 150, actually over 150 years, and I looked at the archives, the rituals that were written many, many, many years ago, and I examined them. I noticed that, well, there were differences from what it is that was going on here today from what it is I'm familiar with. I stayed away from any of what would be considered secrets, and I'm not going to go into what those are, but basically I made no reference whatsoever to anything that was secret, and anything that I had in the book that might even point to something. I think there's one asterisk or two asterisks in the entire book, and ironically, those particular asterisks are things that are well known in the written world, but I just didn't feel comfortable putting it in there. If you're a Mason, you know what the asterisk is. If you're not a Mason and you've read rituals from years past, and even encyclopedias on Masonry, you might be able to figure it out, but I didn't want to put it down there. It's just something that I'm uncomfortable going that far into. But on the same token, I was putting all elements from the rituals that were written, again, over 150 years ago, and trying to interconnect them between the 3 degrees, the rituals, the lectures, and catechisms, to make sense, to have continuity, so that a newly raised Master Mason would be able to take a hold of this book and say, oh, that's what all that means. Mm-hmm. I didn't intend it for fellowcraft. I didn't intend it for EAs. I did intend it for the Master Mason group. And ironically, I'm hearing anecdotal stories of 75 and 80-year-old Masons who are grabbing a hold of this book, and they're basically going into their room and studying it and not wanting to be disturbed. I have heard some very, very nice stories about things that they have about, wow, I've always suspected that, but I've never had it put so clearly. That brings a nice warm feeling to me that there's further light being shared, even at this stage.
And I would say that certainly speaks to the testament of what this book's delivering. Because it's hard to convey, even just in a brief interview talking about it, the level of detail it's into, that it really digs down into some pretty symbolic stuff. It really goes into some aspects of Masonry that most probably don't ever even think of. I know a few of the things caught me off guard, and just what I came across. What did you think, Dean?
I was going to say the last section I thought was totally interesting, and I'd recommend that people pick up the book just for the very last section of all sections. I guess I'll leave it at that. I know I'm leaving a little bit of the read you into the book. I mean, but I don't want to get into too much detail about the last section. But essentially, do I give it away, John? Do I talk about it?
Feel free to talk about the book. There's nothing in here that is secret. It's all available out in the world. And if there are people interested in hearing about it, let's talk about it. We've got another half an hour. I was amazed at the Master's Wage. I had approached it from two different angles, and basically I was looking at the Fellowcraft wages and finding that usually 3 is a dominant theme in different aspects of Masonry, but 4 pops up every once in a while. The last 4 steps of the 7 steps is distinctly different from that which is the first 3 of the 7 steps. And when I was looking at the wages, I said, okay, so the wages of a Fellowcraft are the 3 that we hear about. And I started looking at them and saying, I just wonder if there is this connection with the 4th part of the circle anywhere. And I wondered if the Master's Wages had anything to do with the 4 parts of the circle. And so I looked at all 3 that were given at the Fellowcraft, and I said, well, what would they symbolize? And I tried to draw a correlation directly to the 4 classic elements, and I said, it's just not connecting. But when I started bridging the gap between merging the different elements, adding them together, I said, well, that could be this and that could be that, and it just opened up the door to, well, what's this and that? That's that 4th connection going on. And as it unfolded, if I go into the classic elements of the fire, water, air, and earth, and I start looking at that 4th one pops up, and it's crystal. And it opened a whole different dimension into what could that be? As I investigated further and asked what might be something very, very important 200, 300 years ago to people who are living as craftsmen, what would be really important for them to survive? And then I put the connection up, and as soon as I made the connection to what it was, I went back into the Bible, and darn if I didn't find it. It's right there in the Bible. The rebuilding of King Solomon's temple, you've got actually 4 wages being given to the builders of God's house, and I said, wow, that's not mentioned in the ritual that I have, and yet it's right there out of the Bible. And the interesting thing is that when I looked at the Bible passage, the numbers in the Bible passage actually spoke something to me. And I said, if I took that and reduced it to the common element, you basically have the 3-4-5 triangle. And so you've got the 3-4-5 triangle playing into this whole theme of what the Master's Wages is, because a direct pointing into the biblical passage of where it actually says what the Master's Wages is.
Maybe it would be good, John, tell us about the 3-4-5 triangle. I know you and I talked about it a little bit leading up into this. From what you discovered and your connections that you pulled together to put this book together, tell us how you came to it and what you came to in that idea.
The 3-4-5 triangle, I kept on asking myself the same question again and again. Where is it in ritual that the numbers 3, 4, 5 interplay? If I take a look at 3-4-5, I can get that from adding 3 and 4 and getting 7, and that's the 7 steps, and then you've got 5, and before that, well, you can go into it that way. You can look at 3, 4, 5 as the circumambulations going around, escalating from one degree to the next, the numbers that go around. I wanted something that was a little bit more apparent, something that was so obvious it just hit you in the nose when you looked at it. And I just literally pulled my hair out for 3 weeks trying to figure out where this 3, 4, 5 appeared. And as I searched documents and searched other people's writings, there was the circumambulation that came up. Nobody mentioned the 3, 4, 5 connection having to do with the staircase. I had to put it away. It literally was cramping my brain. And so I started working on the working tools. And as I was going through the working tools and I was summarizing, I started saying, okay, so first degree, we've got the first 2, and we've got the second degree, we've got 3, 4, 5. And there it was. I literally came across it by just kind of summarizing the working tools, and bam, the American ritual has 3, 4, 5 right there as the working tools that are introduced. and ritual. And you won't see that, though, in the emulation ritual. There is 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, 6. But 3, 4, 5 is in the American rendering of ritual. And if you look at the working tools that are there, basically they are the 3 working tools. If you start looking at them, you can actually figure out which one's the vertical, which one is the horizontal, and which one is the hypotenuse by the way that they are introduced as working tools, the way that they interplay with each other. And it was like it's there right in front of us, 3, 4, 5, right in front of us, and nobody mentions it, but it's right there.
That same 3, 4, 5, that same idea is, we talked a little bit about earlier this week, and symbolically how that idea gets carried out and put into play in other traditions as well. And not necessarily in this book, but some of the interesting connections that are pulled together with these ideas and the possibilities of all these different symbols. The ability to draw these parallels and connections and conclusions and try to create these meanings, to dig into them and actually find these meanings out in them.
Well,
it sounds like
it's a veil upon a veil upon a veil. And I'll give you an example of a typical veil upon a veil. The winding staircase, you've got your 7 in the uppermost steps. Most people, particularly nowadays, don't realize that the entered apprentice back about 200 years ago, and again, I'm throwing numbers out here, but quite a while ago, there were 7 steps in the EA degree. And most people don't recognize them today because they're broken into basically 3 and 4. But there are 7 steps. And if you look at them, they're basically the 7 virtues that we are taught as an EA. And there is loose reference to Jacob's ladder in that also. But we don't hear about that today in American ritual. It's not in there. You don't have the mention of the 7 steps. And you've got that in the EA. You've got that in the next, fellowcraft. And I'm looking right now for 7 steps in the Master Mason. And I'm sure if I look hard enough, I'm going to make a connection somewhere.
So, John, you did a lot of digging and working and thinking. I mean, you just mentioned in your talk that you spent like 3 weeks trying to find 3, 4, 5. How long did it take you to write this book?
Oh, gosh. I steadfastly started working on it about a year ago. Prior to that, I have made some of these connections, and I shared them in Lodge and Masonic education and loose lectures where I scribbled notes and just kind of shared them with the groups. But I didn't diligently start working on it until about a year ago when I was encouraged by brothers in my lodge to put something together that would be interesting, that would be kind of, by listening to it, you'd be on the edge of your seat. And so I said, well, how about a catechism? And they said, that's it. Let's go with one of these on a catechism. Let's try it out. In fact, one of them volunteered to be the person who received the questions, and I would be the one who gave them. And we delivered one of them in Lodge, and not one eye in the entire group was glassed over. Everybody was on the edge of their seat. In fact, there was a few mouths that were dropped open with some of the information we were sharing. The connections are just wonderful. In fact, the last time I was in Lodge, one of the brothers who suggested that I do this, he said, I read this, but listening to it is utterly different. You can read this and you can listen to it, and listening to it, so much more pops up. So I wrote this with the idea that, well, you can study it, but you can also share it in Lodge, or you can also share it around with brothers. And each time you do it in a different way, there's different things that come to light. It's kind of the gift that keeps on giving.
Well, I did want to bring up, actually, that right in the beginning of your book, you offer this as a great people to read this out in Lodge as part of their education, don't you? Or did I misread that? Yes,
and that has to be done very carefully because depending on the jurisdiction, you cannot bring stuff into the Lodge unless it's approved. So if you do plan on doing any of this, you just got to make sure that everything's copacetic with your jurisdiction laws. I have shared these catechisms before with permission of, obviously, the Worshipful Master. This is something that goes over very well for brothers who are wanting to make connections and wanting to see and hear and actually put together things in a whole different way. And basically I did this with the book. I sewed all 3 rituals together in such a way that when you ask about the penalties, how do these things apply to our lives today? The jurisdictions that are doing away with them are saying that, oh, these are just symbolic. If you actually listen to these penalties, you recognize that these are not something that is done to a person who takes them on. It's merely an acknowledgement of what we do to ourselves when we are not our word. And there are increasing levels of things that we do to ourselves as we do not keep our word. And nobody else has to do anything to us. We're doing it to ourselves. Now, I'll give you an example. If you give me your word that you're going to do something and I turn around and I find out that you didn't do it, well, why would you need your tongue? It's of no use to me to listen to you because basically your word's no good. And if you continue to do that, you find out, well, who I'm now speaking with, basically you can see that the person's passions are somewhere else. They're being directed elsewhere. So what good is their heart? And last but not least, if they continue to do that, I recognize that as an observer that that person's literally being torn in two different directions. They want to say yes and that they will do something and give their word, but basically they're actually going in a whole different direction. It's like a passive aggressiveness. So I'm seeing two different people, two halves of a person. And I'm not doing anything to that person who's not keeping their word. They're doing it all to themselves. And all I'm doing is observing what they're doing to themselves. They're literally tearing themselves apart piece by piece by not being their word. And how do we communicate this to our fellow Masons, that all these things that we see and hear and take on and that are being downplayed, these are real. These are things that are actually happening to us, and though they're represented symbolically, it's basically an acknowledgement. We're being given wisdom that's been handed down over the ages that, hey, we're trying to tell you, if you don't be your word, here's what you do to yourself. Interesting. And so
interesting.
We've got penalties, and we've got this missing word. That what is this wonderful word that everybody's supposed to be looking for? And the fact is that it's right there in front of you, and people don't see it.
Yeah, wasn't that the last section, or was that another section very close to that? Because that was kind of the one that I was talking about that I thought was very interesting, the Lost Word Catechism. Yeah, I definitely think that this book, it's small, but it is dynamic, and it's fit it in your pocket and actually take it somewhere to read it is really it's not small. There's 160 pages of content in here. It's not small in content, but like I took this to Lodge the other day and showing some of the guys, telling them to get on here to listen to this, and it fit into my apron pocket too. I might add too. So
I liken it to astronaut food. All you have to do is add water, and it expands. And in this particular case, all you have to do is open it up and add time, and it will expand in ways that you never imagined. In fact, again, I wrote the book, and it astounds me at how much there is in this book, and I wrote it.
Well, one thing I'm going to say is you should give me a decoder ring when you give me the book, though, because I have to pull out my encyclopedia to read some of that.
Are you referring to the cipher that's in there?
Yeah, there's a lot of cipher in the book. He loaded it with cipher, and I haven't gone yet to uncipher some of the cipher. I have the ability to do that, but I haven't done that yet.
Haven't taken the time yet.
The cipher is very, very fundamentally a substitution cipher. This is stuff that I remember reading about in first and second grade when I purchased books about encoding. Simple pigeon code. I was taught it in Boy Scouts as a Cub Scout, Boy Scout code. And I got that particular code. It looks very much like Templar code, and it could be construed as Templar code, but it's basically just a simple substitution code. And if you can figure out the simple substitution, what it'll lead to is a wonderful uncovering of levels of further decoding. Because there's actually, as you progress through the book and learn how things are coded and encoded, it progresses to further levels. And I think there's actually 6 or 7 levels when you finally get to the end, that if you learn in the beginning how to decode things and how things unfold, you can actually figure out the code all the way to the end just by continually progressing forward with what it is that you learned with the previous cipher. It's a simple cipher code, and I kind of put it in there because after I got done reading The Staircase Unwound, I recognized that those last 7 steps, if a person actually went through and actually traversed those 7 steps, the first 3 steps are all about symbols as words. We're talking about, if you look at the 3 categories of the first 3 of the 7, it all has to do with a progression of learning about symbols as words. And the last one actually prepares you for symbols as numbers. And if you know anything about the 7 liberal arts and sciences, that these were studies that prepared people for serious further study in theology and philosophy. Basically, how to know symbols, or basically the logos. And if you go through these last 7 steps as a fellowcraft and learn them very well, deciphering code is nothing. It's really a simple task to do. And so I threw it in there as saying, okay, these are encoding. Basically, I'm encoding words and numbers. And if you have gone through the 7 steps and diligently studied, serious study in numbers and letters, well, these particular ciphers should be a piece of cake. And ironically, on some of the forums that are online, some people who have actually been trained in cipher agree with me. So I must have thrown something out there that was worthwhile. And I think you'll find as you go through, if you do decoding, you'll find some pleasant surprises, little hints about a little deeper meaning of the chapters. And it's fun. It's more fun to do the decoding than the actual prize at the end. And I'd like to say that the prize is actually being able to do it.
Cool. Well, it does give you like something to do, you know, while you're looking at the book. You're wondering what all this is. It's like so you're saying not only is this a book with catechisms in it, but a whole level of puzzles too.
It's an education tool on a lot of levels, you know, and that's sort of the Easter egg for going through its symbolic aspect of the different inclusions and the education aspects of it. And then even the time that it takes to dig these little kernels out. There's a lot of little wisdom in here that exists on every page and, you know, hiding underneath other words. I'm really amazed at the complexity and the depth of this book and what's inside of it. I've not come across a book like this in a long time that lays it out this way, that in each line really talks about the symbolism so well. That, to me, is what struck me as the most fantastic. Now I've got to ask, John, what do you do for a day job? Obviously, we're all not professional Masons here. How did the daytime job give you the ability to pull off a book like this?
Let me give you a very short background. I have a BS in electrical engineering, Masters of Science in Engineering Management. I don't manage engineers. I was trained to engineer managers, and I was in engineering for many, many years and decided to retire, and I still wanted to do engineering, so I got involved in working on myself. Currently, I am the CEO for Coaching for Success, Incorporated. I am a business and life coach, been one for over 20 years now. I am also a state certified mediator. I'm also an ordained minister. I got a doctorate in ministry, and I like to write. And so I have multiple caps that I wear. One of the topics I like to write about is Masonic subjects, particularly connecting the dots, just trying to make sense out of something that is so beautiful that, from my viewpoint, didn't make sense to me at first. In fact, I can tell you, when I was listening to the Orders of Architecture, I was like going off into Zootland. How do these pillars, how do they apply to my life? You know, I'm talking about, this is 21st century, and they're talking about stone columns. How does that apply to me? And lo and behold, I started looking at the Orders of Architecture, and I went through all the ritual to find out where they mentioned pillars and columns, and it started making sense. They mention it several different places. There's a direct connection to the 3 central officers in the lodge, and of course, the 3 central officers have an overlay of symbolic meaning, and yet nobody has asked me, why building Hiram? So I'm just going to throw that out to you and say, I have yet to be asked, why building Hiram?
Why building Hiram?
Yes.
Why building Hiram?
If you look at the office that stands for Hiram, it stands for beauty. It stands for a aspect that, if you really do get what it is that Masonry is all about, we're talking about building beauty. That's why I chose that particular title, particularly with this volume. we've got a bunch of master masons that are coming through, such as myself, that just didn't make the connection. And here I said, wow, as I got done doing these catechisms, I said, what did I build here? Well, I built beauty. This, for me, was what I see as beautiful. And I wanted to share that. And a Mason who here is building Hiram, I'm hoping that they'll understand the overlaying of symbols behind that word. I had a neighbor who was a Mason, and he introduced me to Masonry long before I became a Mason. And he literally planted a Trojan horse. He got me reading books like Born in Blood and a few others that have Masonic themes. And he got into my head and he got into my heart. And then he took off and he moved. And here I was with a whole bunch of questions and just a absolute interest in what this Masonry was all about. And when I got done and when I started doing my EA and Fellowcraft and Master Mason and started looking into all this, I recognized that that little Trojan horse, that bugger, that brother of mine who moved to Arizona, he planted within me the seed of beauty. And so what I did was I took it, I ran with it, and I was able to build something very beautiful. And so when I went to name this book, in a sense, it's a testament to my brother. He planted something within me that sprouted, and I wanted to honor that. So hence the title, Building Hiram, Building Beauty. This is what we as Masons, I believe firmly that we are here to do, is build beauty. And so when I wrote the book, I recognized that, wow, the overall theme of this book may be building beauty. It's integrity of one's word. If you look at every single chapter, the theme is continually out there, the importance of being your word. And I find that if you are your word and you continually be your word, you're continually building beauty. So that's why the title.
Why Volume 1?
I got done with this book, and I was doing the final proofing on it, and there was an inspiration, and it just occurred to me, I can't stop here. If this is just what I can do at the Master Mason level, I wonder what I could write further. And instantly, put Volume 1 down there, I was graced with enough material, library-wise, to complete another 11 volumes. The Volume 2, right now, it's focusing on EA, and it's that foundation, very much like what we're talking about with the tree. It's taking a look at what is so crucial to making sure that whatever is built upon that foundation is going to be rock solid and filled with a tremendous amount of integrity. I see, again, I made mention that we've got 7 steps in the EA degree having to do with virtues, and that alone could take up 7 catechisms. It may wind up only being 1, but there's so much to be looked into, and I'm making more connections as the day goes on. And that's what is going to be coming down the pike within the year.
Also, you have a new book coming out? Yeah, I was going to ask, maybe tell us, a little bit about what books you have coming out and where we can get them.
Well, this one book, Building Hiram, can be found on your website, if I'm not mistaken. And
you can. We've actually sold a few this week, actually, and I'm glad to see that good material like this is being sold and people are reading stuff like this. So.
I've got other books like EA Focus Volume 2. I've got other books that I've written like Provoking Success, Uncommon Coaching for the Uncommon Soul, and I've got another one having to do with Emotional Awareness Made Easy, Uncommon Sense About Everyday Feelings. And ironically, aspects of that particular book will make it into the EA degree because, let's face it, if we're going to be circumscribing our desires and keeping our passions within due bounds, shouldn't we have a rock-solid emotional awareness?
For sure.
Well, I didn't even realize how profound that book was going to be in the next volume, but it's going to shine very nicely. I've created the foundation for it, so all I have to do is get my fingers on the keyboard. I also am going to be focusing over the next year on a book on practical spirituality, and I've got all the resources, and it's just a matter of finding the time to put it down into text. These are things that are coming up.
Excellent.
That is excellent. And just to reiterate, we do actually have the book up on our website now. This book is absolutely one of the best books that I think you could put your hands on. I plan to be writing something about it in the next few days to let everybody else know about this that's not listening to the show and just the importance of it. It's
just to correct you,
so we have them available. So definitely stop on by and pick it up and enjoy it. Dig out of it everything that you ever wanted to dig out of it. I think you'll find lots and lots of information in it. John, I don't mean to be so hasty here at the end, but I know we're running out of time. We got about 4 minutes left. Thanks for coming on our show. I really appreciate you being on here and taking the time to tell us about this book and talk to us a little bit about the symbolism and the education in it, and give us a preview of some of the Easter eggs that are in it for those that want to dig into and start deciphering the cipher. Check out the book. It's on our website, Building Hiram, Uncommon Catechism for Uncommon Masonic Education, Volume 1. Author John Nagy is on our website, freemasoninformation.com. We are trailing out the last minute here.
Well, it's been great talking to you today, and Greg, we'll see you in the East.
All right, everybody, this is Greg Stewart. Visit our website, freemasoninformation.com. Send us an email, masoniccentrals@gmail.com.
You've been watching A Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.